Volume 1, The Taste of Defeat. Chapter 1, The Scent of Vanilla in Hell. 1943, Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. For the soldiers of the 17th Army of the Imperial Japanese Army, hell was not fire, nor was it explosions. It was hunger. Here, the smell of death was a mixture of rotting leaves, moldy uniforms, and unburied corpses. With every breath, they inhaled the decaying scent of defeat. Soldiers dug for tree roots in the mud, caught lizards, and stared with salivating mouths at passing rats just to survive. But on the same ocean, just a few dozen miles away, another scent was spreading. It wasn't gunpowder. It wasn't blood. It was vanilla. It was chocolate. It was strawberry. This was not a hallucination, nor was it a flashback before death. This was the United States Navy's ultimate secret weapon. While the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo was calculating the transportation cost of every single grain of rice and demanding soldiers shatter like jewels for the emperor, logistics officers in Washington were struggling with a very different problem: how to ensure that Marines on the front lines in the 100-degree equatorial heat could eat ice cream at least 3 times a week. Japanese Commander Tsuji Masanobu once wrote in his diary with despair, "Our men are eating wild grass. If they are lucky enough to catch a rat, it is a feast. But this war, this damn war, the other side doesn't seem to treat it as a life-and-death struggle at all. Are they on vacation?" This is the cruelest truth of this war. On one side, beasts struggling for survival. On the other, tourists complaining about the quality of life. Chapter 2, The Concrete Ghost. To understand the humiliation brought by this waste, we must first understand what distance means. The Pacific Theater was the most brutal test of logistics in human history. Every bullet, every barrel of oil, every bandage had to cross half the globe. For Japan, this supply line was a fragile vein, liable to be severed by U.S. submarines at any moment. By 1943, Japan's merchant marine loss rate exceeded its construction rate, and their supply strategy was forced to become local self-sufficiency, a polite term that translated to robbing locals or starving to death. But the Americans were different. Americans didn't just want to transport bullets, they wanted to transport a complete lifestyle. In 1944, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps received a special appropriation request. The Navy requested the construction of a concrete barge costing $1 million, equivalent to $17 million today. Its mission description was a single line: to provide mobile morale support for the Western Pacific Theater. This ship had zero combat capability. It was slow, clumsy, and looked like a floating concrete tombstone. But its loadout was enough to destroy the enemy's worldview. It could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes and 500 gallons every hour. Its storage space could hold 2,000 tons of frozen meat, 500 tons of fresh vegetables, and 1,500 gallons of ice cream mix. This was not war. This was industrial might bullying an agrarian society. While Japanese Private Oshima counted his remaining bullets in the rainforest, this American concrete ghost was churning out this easily melted, nutritionally void sweet treat, existing purely for pleasure at the speed of an industrial assembly line. Chapter 3, The Blender at 30,000 feet. For the Japanese troops on the front lines, the most terrifying moment was often not when the bombing started, but after the bombing ended, when the wind blew the scent of the U.S. camp over. It was grilled steak, toasted bread, and the most unbelievable smell of all, sweetness. Japanese scout Sakamoto Taro described this moment of cognitive collapse in his diary. The commander said, "The Americans are weak rich boys who can't fight without their mother's milk bottles, but I saw them distributing white stuff. At first, I thought it was medicine or rice balls, until I saw an American soldier drop the stuff on the ground and he didn't even pick it up. He just laughed and went to get another one. At that moment, I understood. We are killing people for a grain of rice. They are throwing away food. This enemy is a monster we cannot defeat." This kind of excess even spawned a strange battlefield culture within the U.S. military. In various air squadrons across the South Pacific, an open secret circulated. What do you do if you want ice cream but the supply ship hasn't arrived? You just fly high enough. The U.S. Marine Corps Fighter Squadron 122 invented a tactical ice cream manufacturing mission. They modified the drop tanks of their F-4U Corsair fighters, filling them not with fuel, but with a mixture of milk and cocoa powder. The pilots climbed to 30,000 feet, where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and the vibration of the aircraft engine acted as a mixer. While Japanese pilots dared not conduct training flights to save fuel, and even had to calculate fuel for takeoff to intercept enemies, American pilots were flying fighter jets worth millions of dollars, burning precious high-octane aviation fuel just to have a cup of slushy upon landing. This was thorough, unadulterated showing off. It was like a boxer in the middle of a match, not only not panting, but sitting down to order a Michelin star meal and asking his opponent, "Do you want a bite?" Chapter 4. The Truth in the Trash. If the distant ice cream ship was a myth, then the nearby garbage dump was the hammer of reality. 1944, Saipan. A captured Japanese ensign recorded his first shock after entering the U.S. camp in his post-war memoirs. It wasn't interrogation, nor was it beating. It was garbage. He saw U.S. Army cooks dumping a whole bucket of white stuff into a pit. It was mashed potatoes. Then came half a canned ham that hadn't been finished. In the Japanese unit, that can would have kept a squad of soldiers alive for 3 days. They would have fought over the grease at the bottom of the can. He couldn't help but ask the American, "Why? Is it spoiled?" The American looked at him, with no hatred in his eyes, only confusion. He shrugged and said, "No, just because lunch is over and we're having steak for dinner." At that moment, the ensign realized the emperor had been lied to, or rather, all of Japan had been lied to. They were facing not a country, but a factory of overproduction. This war was no longer a duel between warriors, but a war between a beggar and a billionaire. The beggar might have a sharper knife, fiercer eyes, and even desperate courage. But the billionaire didn't even need to draw a knife. He only needed to bury the beggar slowly and elegantly with truckload after truckload of supplies. This ice cream barge was not just a mobile freezer. It was a nuclear weapon of psychological warfare. It signaled to every ally who saw it, "We are powerful enough to waste." It signaled to every enemy who heard of it, "Your resistance is futile because you struggle to survive while we enjoy life." Volume 2, The Arsenal of Democracy. Chapter 5, The Bottled American Dream. If anything other than ice cream could represent this logistical humiliation, it was that glass bottle with the unique curves. On June 29, 1943, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower sent an urgent telegram. In this message marked urgent, he didn't ask for more tanks, nor did he ask for more fuel. He demanded Washington immediately ship 3 million bottles of Coca-Cola, along with enough concentrated syrup and complete bottling equipment to produce 6 million bottles a month. Note that he didn't want the finished product. He wanted the entire production line. He wanted to ensure that even in the deserts of North Africa or the ruins of Italy, the moment an American GI popped the cap, the hiss he heard was exactly the same as what he heard at the grocery store in his hometown in Kansas. To meet this request, the U.S. military made an astonishing move. They granted technical observer status with officer rank to Coca-Cola technicians. These so-called cola colonels, wearing uniforms, built 64 battlefield bottling plants on the front lines. While Japanese soldiers drank river water full of parasites in the jungle and German soldiers melted snow in the bitter winter, American soldiers only needed to drop a nickel to get an ice-cold, bubbling black sweet water from a vending machine. This was not just sugar water, it was an ideology encapsulated in a glass bottle. For frontline soldiers, this bottle meant home hasn't forgotten us. For the enemy who captured these cokes, this fragile glass bottle was a terrifying signal. It meant the enemy's industrial tentacles had extended to the capillaries of the battlefield. If they could transport fragile glass bottles and carbonated drinks across oceans to the trenches unscathed, what couldn't they? A Japanese prisoner once described his feeling when he drank Coke for the first time. It was a strange medicinal taste, but it made people feel an inexplicable fear. Because this bottle of water told me their factories were still running, their workers were still working, and their convoys were unimpeded. And we couldn't even receive a letter from home. Chapter 6, Turkey versus Katana. Time moved to Thanksgiving, 1944. The war had entered its bloodiest meat grinder phase. Logically, the logistical priority should have been ammunition, plasma, and morphine, but the U.S. Logistics Department made another stunning decision, Ensure that every soldier on the front line, whether in a foxhole in the Ardennes forest or on a B-29 bomber in the Pacific, could eat a hot turkey dinner. This was a logistical nightmare, and also a logistical flex. For this meal, hundreds of tons of frozen turkey departed from the U.S. mainland. Specialized refrigerated convoys shuttled across the war-torn European continent. In the Pacific, destroyers even acted as delivery boys, delivering roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie to remote reefs. Data shows that in 1944 alone, the U.S. shipped 1.6 tons of cranberry sauce overseas. Was this extreme waste? From a military perspective, yes. This transport capacity could have been used to ship millions of bullets. But from a psychological perspective, it was a strategic victory. Across the lines, Germans were eating black bread mixed with sawdust, and the Japanese were eating moldy rice. Meanwhile, the scent of roasted turkey wafted from American positions. This smell was more lethal than any surrender leaflet. It directly pierced the enemy's psychological defense, a defense supported by spiritual power and willpower. The Japanese army emphasized Yamato Damashi, Japanese spirit, stressing that spirit conquers matter. They told soldiers hunger was training and scarcity was a test. But when Americans delivered a Thanksgiving feast to the trenches, they proved a cruel truth with action. Spirit might conquer temporary hunger, but a powerful industrial material base can directly eliminate hunger itself. In this duel between the turkey and the katana, the turkey won. Chapter 7. The Burning Superiority. On the battlefield, cigarettes are not just carriers of nicotine, they are currency, painkillers, and social tools. During World War II, Japanese soldiers smoked Golden Bat or Light brand cigarettes. By the late war period, due to material shortages, these cigarettes were mixed with large amounts of tobacco stems or even dried leaves, wrapped in rough paper that tore easily and often couldn't be lit in the humid jungle. It was a bitter, choking smoke that smelled of despair. In contrast, American soldiers had pockets full of Lucky Strike, Camel, or Chesterfield. These cigarettes were wrapped in cellophane, a tiny but deadly detail. Cellophane meant moisture resistance, meaning in the tropical rainforest, when you crawled out of a mud pit, your cigarettes were still dry. More importantly, the quantity. The U.S. supply of cigarettes was virtually infinite. They didn't need to pick up cigarette butts, they could throw them away half-smoked. The gap was even more obvious in ignition tools. Japanese soldiers used damp matches, often striking 10 without lighting one. American soldiers held Zippo lighters. The crisp clink sound when the metal lid opened became one of the most recognizable sounds of World War II. It was windproof, durable, and reliable. Even in the harshest environments, it lit on the first try. This reliability was a luxury Japanese troops couldn't understand. When a Japanese soldier watched an American prisoner take out a Zippo and easily light a cigarette, he felt not just envy, but a deep suspicion of his own industrial system. If you can make a lighter like a precision instrument, how terrifying must your tanks be? Chapter 8. The Spam Paradox. However, this excess supply brought a side effect. The U.S. military became the first and only army in human history to start complaining because supplies were too abundant. In letters home in 1944, the object American soldiers complained about most was not Germans or Japanese, but a pink block of meat, Spam. Spam again? Damn it, can't we have some fresh beef? These complaints filled U.S. camps. For U.S. logistics officers, this was a sweet trouble. But if these letters were intercepted and sent to a Japanese commander's desk, the person reading them would feel a chill in their bones. Imagine when your men are going night-blind from malnutrition, losing teeth from scurvy, and eating the corpses of comrades out of hunger. Your enemy is complaining that having meat for every meal is too greasy. This complaint itself was the highest level of humble bragging. It marked that the war potential of the two sides was no longer in the same dimension. Data shows that an American soldier's average daily caloric intake was over 4,000 calories, while by 1944, a Japanese soldier's ration was often less than 800 calories and frequently cut off. This war was no longer a duel between warriors, but a war between a beggar and a billionaire. The beggar might have a sharper knife, fiercer eyes, and even desperate courage. But the billionaire didn't even need to draw a knife. He only needed to slowly and elegantly bury the beggar with truckload after truckload of canned food. Chapter 10. God's Medicine Chest. If creating death is the norm of war, then reversing death is the miracle of war. Early in World War II, an injury on the battlefield often meant amputation or death. Infection was a killer more terrible than bullets. But by 1944, American soldiers had a life-saving artifact in their pockets: sulfonamide powder and later, the liquid gold, penicillin. During the Normandy landings, penicillin production was still pitifully low. But American chemical giants mobilized to turn this laboratory mold into an industrial assembly line product. By the end of the war, the US military could even afford the luxury of using penicillin to treat venereal diseases, while for the German and Japanese armies, antibiotics remained legendary miracle drugs reserved only for high-ranking officers. Besides drugs, there was blood. The US established the most efficient blood cold chain transport system in human history. A bottle of whole blood drawn from a Boston citizen's arm could be dripping into the vein of a wounded soldier on the beaches of Iwo Jima within 48 hours via refrigerated air transport. This rescue effort, sparing no cost for a single life, gave American soldiers immense psychological security. They knew that as long as they had a breath left, the powerful logistics system would send helicopters, jeeps, or even submarines to fish them out, using the best medicine and the best blood. Conversely, Japanese soldiers were taught injury is shame, and the severely wounded were often left with a grenade to end it themselves. This was not just a cultural difference, it was a difference in industrial capability, because Japan simply did not have enough medicine and transport capacity to recover their damaged parts. Chapter 11: Hollywood's Expedition. Among all non-essential logistical supplies, entertainment might be the most incomprehensible to the enemy. The US military believed that making soldiers laugh was as important as making them shoot. Thus, the USO, United Service Organizations, was born. This wasn't just a few singers going to the front to sing songs. It was a massive entertainment industrial system. Bob Hope took Hollywood stars, flew on private planes halfway across the globe, and set up stages on islands that had just been taken and were still smoking. Imagine the scene. Thousands of American soldiers sitting in the mud, holding ice-cold Cokes, watching Hollywood's hottest actresses dance on stage, listening to the most popular jazz. The roar from the massive sound equipment even reached Japanese lines miles away. What kind of torture was this for the Japanese hiding in dark tunnels? They listened to the enemy's laughter, that unbridled, vibrant laughter. This laughter declared one thing: war had not destroyed American life. War was just an interlude in their lives. Japanese entertainment consisted of tragic letters home and imperial edicts, oppressive and heavy. American entertainment was Broadway and jazz, moving the hustle and bustle of American culture directly to the center of the battlefield. This was not just a morale boost, it was a cultural dimensional strike. Chapter 12: The Map Editors. We often say combat engineers clear the way, but the US Naval Construction Battalion's Seabees weren't clearing roads, they were reshaping geography. In the battle for Pacific Islands, it took the Japanese 3 months to build a makeshift airfield. They relied on manual labor, using picks and shovels, and forced local labor. But when the Seabees landed, it often took only 3 days. Because they brought not shovels, but bulldozers, graders, and rollers. These yellow steel beasts rampaged through the jungle, uprooting towering trees, flattening hills, and filling swamps. A Japanese commander recalled after the war, "We spent months moving earth with wheelbarrows to barely build a runway. After the Americans came, we watched from the mountains. In just one night, what used to be jungle became flatland. The next day, their planes landed. That was not human power, that was the power of giants in myths." The motto of this engineering corps was "Can Do." They built not only airports, but also piers, roads, movie theaters, and even standardized American barracks. They turned every deserted island they occupied into a small American town. This infrastructure maniac capability meant US advances were no longer constrained by terrain, only by how hard they stepped on the gas pedal. Chapter 13: University Behind Barbed Wire. If the US military on the battlefield was terrifying, the US military in POW camps was confusing. For hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs sent to the US mainland, mostly Texas and the Midwest, they expected hard labor and abuse. After all, Nazi propaganda said Americans were savage cowboys. However, when they stepped off the train, they saw clean barracks, daily hot showers, and food better than what they ate in the German army. This was the famous Texas shock. In these POW camps, the biggest punishment was not whipping, but a reduction in cigarette rations. POWs could even earn wages by picking cotton or harvesting corn, then buy beer and chocolate at the camp canteen. Even more exaggerated was education. The U.S. provided books, musical instruments, and even university courses for POWs. Many German prisoners earned degrees and learned English while incarcerated. This treatment shattered Nazi brainwashing. A German prisoner wrote to his family, "If you knew what kind of life I live here, you would put down your weapons and surrender immediately. This is not a prison, this is the backyard of heaven." This was the most brilliant psychological warfare. Don't destroy enemies with bullets, but convert them with an affluent lifestyle. When these prisoners returned to Germany after the war, they became the staunchest salesmen of American democracy because they had personally experienced how lucky it was to be conquered by America. Chapter 14. DDT and the Hygiene War. Finally, let's talk about cleanliness. Before World War II, more soldiers often died from infectious diseases like typhus and malaria than from combat. Lice, mosquitoes, and flies were tiny enemies harder to deal with than tanks. But in 1944, typhus broke out in Naples. The U.S. military locked down the city and unleashed another chemical weapon, DDT. Millions of civilians and soldiers were sprayed with this white powder from head to toe. As a result, for the first time in human history, a winter typhus epidemic was forcibly extinguished. In the Pacific, U.S. planes sprayed DDT over islands like crop dusters, killing all mosquitoes and insects. Every American soldier had strict hygiene regulations: shave daily, shower regularly, change clean underwear. This insistence on mysophobia seemed pretentious to the Japanese. But strategically, it meant the non-combat attrition rate of the U.S. military was shockingly low. While Japanese soldiers rotted in dirty water, covered in scabies, American soldiers maintained a decency and health unique to industrialized society. This sent a signal: we can not only kill enemies, we can kill viruses and pests. We have the power to control nature. This hygiene hegemony was the most arrogant contempt of industrial civilization for pre-industrial civilization. Volume 3, The Gears of Doom. Chapter 15, Symphony of 8 Rounds. If sound could kill, the deadliest sound in WWII was not the whistle of shells, but a crisp, metallic ping. This was the sound of the M1 Garand rifle ejecting its clip after firing the last round. For German and Japanese infantry, this sound represented a desperate suppression of firepower. At the time, the Japanese used the Type 38 rifle, and the Germans used the Kar 98K. These were bolt-action rifles. The firing process was shoot, manually pull the bolt to eject the shell, push the bolt to load, aim, and shoot again. But the M1 in the hands of American soldiers was semi-automatic. Pull the trigger, bang! No bolt pulling, no re-aiming needed. This meant that in close-quarters combat, the firepower output of one American infantryman was equivalent to 3 to 5 German or Japanese infantrymen. An American infantry squad, 12 men, could instantly unleash a volume of ammo that would pin down an entire opposing platoon. General Patton said, "The M1 is the greatest battle implement ever devised." Behind this sentence was terrifying industrial support. Because semi-automatic rifles are complex, require high machining precision, and consume ammunition extremely fast. Japanese designers tried to develop semi-automatic rifles, but their industrial tolerances couldn't meet the requirements, and their logistics systems simply couldn't support that kind of water hose consumption. When a Japanese soldier was hit while pulling his bolt, he was facing not just a more advanced gun, but more precise lathes and larger ammunition factories. Chapter 16. Red Ball Express and Jerry Cans. Tanks are the kings of land warfare, but fuel is the blood of tanks. After the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944, the biggest challenge was not German resistance, but the speed of advance. The supply lines were stretched infinitely long. Thus, the Red Ball Express was born. It was a never-stopping conveyor belt. Nearly 6,000 trucks raced day and night on the roads from Normandy to the front. Drivers often drove for 20 hours straight, some even falling asleep at the wheel. But in this logistical miracle, there was an ironic detail. The handling tool the US military used most smoothly was actually a German invention. Early in the war, the US used 5-gallon tin drums, which sealed poorly and leaked easily, nicknamed flimsies by soldiers. The Germans used a perfectly designed fuel container, the jerry can. 3 handles, easy for one person to carry 2 or 2 people to carry 1, excellent sealing, and it could even float on water. After capturing these cans, the US military immediately realized their stupidity and quickly reverse-engineered and mass-produced them. By the end of 1944, US trucks were loaded with millions of American-made German jerry cans, filled with American gasoline, driving American tanks to defeat Germany. This is the flexibility of an industrial power. Not only can I produce my own designs, but I can also copy and mass-produce your design overnight, and then use your invention to defeat you. Chapter 17. The War of Nylon and Hose. Before 1941, the main material for making parachutes was silk, and the main source of silk was Japan. After the war broke out, Japan cut off silk supplies, thinking this would leave US paratroopers without chutes. But they miscalculated one thing. DuPont invented nylon. This laboratory-born synthetic fiber was not only strong and elastic, but also completely independent of natural resources. The US rapidly militarized nylon production capacity, using it to make parachutes, flak jackets, tire cords, and even mosquito nets. Japan lost huge foreign exchange earnings from the silk trade, while the US gained a substitute more durable than silk. Even more interesting was the psychological impact of nylon outside the battlefield. In the European theater, the hardest currency in American soldiers' pockets, besides cigarettes and chocolate, was nylon stockings. For European women suffering from the ravages of war, a pair of nylon stockings that had vanished from the market was an irresistible gift. This synthetic fiber became a symbol of American soft power. It told the world, America can control not just steel and oil, but molecular structures. We don't need to rely on nature's gifts, silkworms. We can create better materials with oil and chemical bonds. It was a dimensional strike from a chemical lab against the traditional sericulture industry. Chapter 18. The Floating City. In naval warfare, ship damage is the norm. For the Japanese Navy, if a battleship was damaged, it had to be towed back to the home islands, Kure or Yokosuka ports for repair. The round trip could take months, and the journey was fraught with risk. But the US military said, "Why go back? We'll bring the shipyard to you." This was the floating dry dock. These massive sea monsters could submerge, let a damaged destroyer or even a battleship sail in, then pump out water to surface, lifting the ship out of the water. At Olothi Atoll, the US established a secret forward base. Hundreds of warships were anchored here, along with these floating docks that could fix anything. An aircraft carrier damaged by a kamikaze attack didn't need to return to Pearl Harbor. It just needed to dock at Olothi for 2 weeks, undergo day and night repairs by thousands of engineers and welders, and be fully resurrected to return to the battlefield. This was fatal to the Japanese. They calculated how many US warships they damaged, thinking the US fleet was paralyzed. A few weeks later, those paralyzed warships appeared on the horizon again. Japan was fighting a war of attrition, while the US was fighting a war of self-repair. It was like playing a game where the opponent not only has a long health bar, but regenerates health faster than you can deal damage. Chapter 19. The VT Fuse. Before 1943, anti-aircraft fire relied largely on luck. You needed to set the explosion altitude of the shell, timed fuse, requiring extremely precise calculation, or rely on dense barrage coverage. Then the US introduced the VT fuse, variable time/proximity fuse. This meant putting a miniature radio radar transmitter inside the warhead of every shell. When the shell detected a metal object, plane, it automatically detonated. No direct hit was needed. A near miss could destroy the target. This technology was classified as top secret, even banned for use in European land warfare for fear of unexploded ordnance falling into German hands. But in the Pacific, it was a nightmare for Japanese pilots. Previously, Japanese pilots could rely on superior skills to dodge direct fire. Now, they found American shells seemed to have eyes. They exploded just by flying nearby. Behind this was astonishing electronic industrial strength. To stuff precise vacuum tubes and circuits into a shell that would withstand the massive G-force of firing, 20,000 Gs, and ensure it didn't break, was practically alien technology at the time. The US was even extravagant enough to use these expensive shells against ground infantry, because an airburst 10 meters above soldiers' heads was 10 times more lethal than a ground explosion. This was using the precision craftsmanship of making radios to manufacture disposable death. Chapter 19: The Ugly Mule. If there was one vehicle that won the war, it wasn't the Sherman tank. It was the Jeep. It had no armor, no heavy weapons, and wasn't good looking, but it was everywhere. It had only 4 wheels, an engine, and a steering wheel. The structure was so simple that any farm boy could learn to fix it in half a day. It ran in mud, on sand, and even on rails with steel wheels. Eisenhower listed it as one of the 3 tools that won the war. For the Germans, the Jeep was an enviable luxury. German motorized units had complex models with incompatible parts. American Jeep parts were completely standardized. More terrifying was the quantity. The US produced over 640,000 Jeeps. On average, there were several for every 100 soldiers. Officers rode in them, messengers rode in them, wounded lay on their hoods, and even chaplains used their hoods as altars. On the battlefield, German generals were often seen riding captured Jeeps because they were more reliable than German cars. This little car represented the core philosophy of American industry: standardization, durability, and mass production. It didn't pursue extreme performance, it pursued extreme ubiquity. Chapter 21: The War of Tables and Typewriters. War is not just bloodshed, it is also data processing. The reason the US logistics system was so efficient was that behind it lay a massive bureaucratic system. The movement of every box of supplies was accompanied by a form, a list, and the strike of a typewriter key. In 1944, to manage supplies for the Normandy landings, the US military used thousands of IBM punch card machines. These were the ancestors of computers. They tracked the whereabouts of every pair of boots and every can of Spam. While Japanese logistics officers were still using calligraphy brushes and abacuses to calculate rice stocks, the US was already managing the war with big data. Although this red tape was often criticized by frontline soldiers, it ensured order amidst chaos. It guaranteed that a tanker repairing his vehicle would receive the exact screw for that specific model, rather than a banana. This was a war won behind the scenes by accountants, typists, and inventory managers. With carbon paper and filing cabinets, they built an invisible defensive line of data, precisely directing massive industrial capacity into the heart of the enemy. Chapter 22: Aluminum Clouds. The B-29 Superfortress was the most expensive single-weapon project of World War II, costing even more than the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Why was it so expensive? Because it was the world's first bomber to feature a pressurized cabin. Before this, bomber crews flying at high altitudes had to wear heavy electric flight suits and oxygen masks to endure temperatures of -50 degrees. Inside a B-29, however, pilots could wear short-sleeved shirts, drink hot coffee, and operate instruments as comfortably as if they were sitting in a civilian airliner. When Japanese fighter pilots struggled to climb an oxygen-deprived cold to intercept these silver giants, they faced a group of American college students sitting in a climate-controlled environment operating fire control radar. This comfort itself was a combat capability. It allowed bomber crews to remain alert and focused for long periods. The appearance of the B-29 meant America was no longer just fighting Japan. It was using the physical limits of the atmosphere to crush Japan. They raised the war to the stratosphere, a forbidden zone beyond the reach of Japanese anti-aircraft fire and obsolete fighters. Chapter 23: The Frontline Department Store. The PX, Post Exchange, or base store, was the ultimate manifestation of the US military bringing consumerism into the trenches. In these stores set up behind the front lines, soldiers could buy watches, fountain pens, cameras, razors, magazines, and even ice cream coupons. This was not just to satisfy needs, but to maintain the soldier's civilized identity. The U.S. military believed a soldier was first a consumer and second a warrior. Preserving his consumer habits from capitalist society minimized the psychological alienation caused by war. For recently captured Axis soldiers, walking into a PX was like stepping into another dimension. They saw American soldiers choosing Kodak film and discussing which hair pomade was better. Meanwhile, their own pockets contained only photos of their families and moldy ration tickets. The psychological gap created by this contrast was devastating. While we are desperate to survive, they are still living. They even have the spare money and leisure to shop. It felt not like losing to an army, but losing to a massive commercial empire. Chapter 24: The Willow Run Miracle. Finally, let us return to the source of all these supplies, the factory. At the Willow Run plant near Detroit, Ford Motor Company built a massive structure covering hundreds of acres. It didn't produce cars, it produced B-24 Liberator bombers. This factory possessed an assembly line a mile long. Here, Ford applied the logic of producing the Model T to complex bombers. At first, the workers were clumsy, but by 1944, this factory reached an astonishing peak speed. One 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. What did this mean? It meant that no matter how many planes the German Luftwaffe shot down, they could not keep up with the production speed of this single factory. For Nazi Germany, this was an unsolvable math problem. Their ace pilots might be able to fight 1 against 10, but Willow Run could replace those 10 losses within an hour. When Hitler looked at the shrinking defensive lines on his map in his bunker, he was actually being strangled by this assembly line. This line didn't rest, didn't sleep, had no emotions, and coldly churned out death vehicles at a rate of 1 per hour. This was the ultimate embodiment of industrialized warfare, the quality of quantity. Volume 3: The Invisible Veins. Chapter 25: Arteries Under the Sea. In 1944, after the Allies landed in Normandy, they faced a massive paradox. Modern armies are fuel-guzzling monsters. A Sherman tank consumed 1.5 gallons of gasoline per mile. The daily fuel consumption of an armored division was astronomical. The usual solution was tankers, but tankers were slow, large targets, and required ports to dock. The newly liberated French ports were mostly destroyed or mined by the Germans. So, British engineers came up with a crazy plan: Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. This was no ordinary engineering feat. In a matter of weeks, flexible hollow pipes similar to undersea cables were wound onto giant spools like thread, towed by ships, and laid directly on the seabed across the English Channel. For German commanders, this was completely beyond their comprehension. They watched Allied tank units race across the French plains and wondered, where are their fuel trucks? Why can't their supply lines be cut? The answer lay underwater. These invisible arteries pumped 1 million gallons of fuel daily from Britain directly to the front. While German tanks were forced to become stationary turrets or were abandoned by crews due to lack of fuel, Allied tankers could luxuriously idle their engines for warmth. This undersea pipeline was a mockery of traditional war logic. Since transporting oil is too troublesome, we'll simply extend the oil well's outlet 100 miles and connect it directly to your doorstep. Chapter 27: The Vomit of the Green Dragon. If there was an iconic image of the Normandy landings, it was the LST, landing ship tank, opening its massive bow doors and vomiting tanks directly onto the beach. Sailors jokingly called this ship the large, slow target. It was ugly, bumpy, and slow. But it was the key to changing the form of warfare. Before this, landing operations required capturing a port first, then using cranes to unload cargo. The appearance of the LST meant any stretch of beach could instantly become a busy pier. For Japanese troops defending islands, this was a spatial suffocation. They originally only needed to defend ports and major shipping lanes, but now US tanks could drive directly out of the sea onto any desolate coastline. Inside the belly of the LST were not just tanks, but trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, and even complete field hospitals. It was a walking hinterland. When a Japanese soldier saw this steel monster with its mouth wide open, spewing an endless stream of steel onto the beach, he realized not just the disparity in troop strength, but the absolute conquest of the ocean by industrial civilization. We don't need ports, we bring our own. Chapter 28. The Mathematics of Death. In traditional artillery barrages, after hearing the first explosion, the enemy usually had a few seconds to find cover because shells fell sequentially. But the US introduced a firing technique called TOT, time on target. This was a complex math problem. The command center calculated the position, range, and flight time of different artillery pieces. Distant guns fired first, nearby guns fired later. The goal was singular, to have all shells, regardless of origin, land at the same second. What did this mean for the Germans in the target area? It meant 1 second it was dead silence, and the next second, hundreds or thousands of shells exploded simultaneously. No warning, no time to hide, not even time for fear. This required incredibly precise communication systems and computational power, as well as precise synchronization of watches. A surviving German soldier recalled, "That wasn't a bombardment, that was God using an eraser to wipe the earth." In an instant, the entire camp vanished. This was not just a display of firepower, it was a display of coordination. It told the enemy, we not only have many shells, but our army functions like a precision clock. Chapter 29. Jazz and Tokyo Rose. In the nights of the Pacific, the air carried not only the smell of gunpowder, but also radio waves. The Japanese tried to use broadcasts like Tokyo Rose to disintegrate US morale, playing nostalgic music and using sweet voices to tell GIs, your wife's back home might be dating someone else. But the US had a more powerful weapon, AFRS, Armed Forces Radio Service. The US didn't disdain to create counter-propaganda broadcasts. They directly played the most popular jazz, swing, and comedy shows from the US mainland. The result was absurd. Many Japanese and German soldiers secretly listened to American radio because the music was better and the news was more real. When Glenn Miller's band played the upbeat In the Mood, that rhythm full of freedom, pleasure, and vitality was itself a dimensional strike against the serious, repressive culture of fascism. Music conveyed a subtext. We are not just fighting, we are enjoying culture. We are dancing. This relaxed state made the enemy feel the rigidity and boredom of their own system more than any political propaganda could. Chapter 30. The Dignity of Paper. During the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, the Germans faced severe material shortages, including paper. German orders were often written on the backs of rough recycled paper or even wrapping paper. Toilet paper was a scarce commodity. Meanwhile, the US began firing surrender leaflets at German positions. These leaflets weren't printed casually. They used high-quality coated paper, beautifully printed in vivid colors. Some leaflets were designed as passes, written in German. Holders of this pass will receive safe food and treatment. For German soldiers who struggled to even wipe themselves in the cold wind, these leaflets were primarily excellent toilet paper. But when they held this paper, the tactile sensation from their fingertips was a silent boast. The enemy's paper was better than the fabric of their own uniforms. This material gap in details seeped into the soldier's subconscious. If you use such good paper for leaflets meant to be thrown away, how much stuff is piled up in your warehouses? The quality of paper became the most intuitive litmus test for national power. Chapter 31. The Ronson Sherman. The M4 Sherman tank was often mocked as a Ronson, a lighter brand, because it caught fire easily when hit. In a one-on-one duel, it was far from a match for the German Tiger or Panther tanks. But the reason the Sherman won the war lay precisely in its mediocrity. It was moderately weighted and could cross most European bridges. Tigers were too heavy and often collapsed bridges. It was mechanically reliable with a very low breakdown rate. Tigers often broke down. It was easy to repair. If the transmission broke, it could be replaced in a few hours. More importantly, standardization. The Sherman's engine, tracks, and even bolts were universal. When a Tiger tank's transmission broke, the Germans had to wait for specialized parts shipped from Germany or send engineers to the site. When a Sherman broke, American troops could strip apart from a destroyed Sherman nearby or simply bring up a new one from the rear. Germany pursued artisan-like extreme performance. America pursued industrial product-like extreme efficiency. The battlefield proved that 10 mediocre but moving Shermans could definitely beat one perfect but broken-down Tiger. It was a victory of reliability over performance specs. Chapter 32: The Surprise in K-Rations. For WWII soldiers, eating was not just replenishing calories, it was a blind box experience. Although the U.S. K-ration was complained about by countless GIs as tasting bad, its design was a miracle of industrial packaging. A wax-sealed cardboard box the size of a brick contained breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But what truly broke the enemy was not the canned meat inside, but the accessories. Every K-ration box came with a small packet containing chewing gum, 4 cigarettes, a box of matches, a roll of toilet paper, water purification tablets, and even sugar cubes and instant coffee. When German soldiers captured these rations, they were amazed to find that Americans had compressed a refined life into this small box. Especially the gum and toilet paper. These two things had nothing to do with combat effectiveness, but everything to do with dignity. Chewing gum in a muddy foxhole and using soft toilet paper represented a baseline of civilization. A Japanese soldier wrote in his diary, "Their rations even contain toothpicks. They treat war like a picnic." Chapter 34: The Bring Your Own Harbor. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The Allies knew that once the landing succeeded, the biggest problem would be the lack of deep-water ports to unload heavy supplies. Ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre were heavily guarded by Germans. Churchill said, "If you don't have a harbor, bring one with you." This was the Mulberry Harbor. It was a crazy engineering miracle. The Allies prefabricated massive concrete caissons, some like apartment buildings, several stories high, in Britain, towed them across the channel, and sank them off Omaha and Gold beaches to form artificial breakwaters. Then, floating steel piers were erected to connect to the land. Within days after D-Day, the throughput of this artificial harbor exceeded that of many natural French ports. When German commanders saw aerial photos, they thought they were hallucinating. A city had appeared out of nowhere on the sea. This proved the characteristics of the US-UK industrial system again. Don't rely on geography, don't rely on luck. Use concrete and steel to forcibly alter the natural environment to suit military needs. This was not fighting a war. This was conducting a terraforming project. Chapter 34: The $1,000,000 Trash Pile. When the war ended, a scene on a Pacific island became the most absurd footnote to this logistical war. $1,000,000 Point in Vanuatu. After the war, the U.S. possessed mountains of surplus supplies: bulldozers, trucks, jeeps, cranes, and countless cans of Coke. Shipping these supplies back to the U.S. was too expensive and would even impact the domestic market. So, the U.S. military tried to sell them cheaply to the local British and French colonial governments. But the colonial governments thought the U.S. couldn't take these things away, so they deliberately lowballed the price, hoping to get them for free after the Americans left. The U.S. commander made a decision that shocked the world: destroy it rather than be taken advantage of. Combat engineers built a huge ramp extending into the sea. Then, every day, countless brand new trucks and bulldozers, engines roaring, were driven up the ramp. Drivers jumped out at the last moment, letting these steel beasts plunge into the ocean. Locals watched in horror. Millions of dollars of supplies, representing the crystallized wealth of industry, were used for land reclamation like garbage. This scene was more impactful than the war itself. It displayed a near-arrogant affluence. We created these miracles to win the war. Now that the war is over, these miracles are worthless to us. This is absolute industrial dominance. Creation is for destruction, and destruction is to prove we don't care. Volume 4: Technology as a Weapon. Chapter 35: The Magic Eye in the Night. Early in WWII, the Japanese Navy prided itself on its night combat capabilities. Japanese sailors underwent rigorous night vision training, reportedly able to see dark shapes miles away under starlight. They believed the night was the samurai's ally, a shield neutralizing U.S. air superiority. However, by 1943, this confidence turned into fear.
Japanese captains discovered that in pitch-black nights, where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, American shells hit their bridges with pinpoint accuracy. This wasn't magic, it was microwave radar, SG radar. While the Japanese still relied on owl-like vision, the US had installed rotating parabolic antennas on warship masts. This magic eye could penetrate darkness, rain, and fog, clearly depicted the enemy's outline, distance, and even heading on a fluorescent screen. The psychological pressure brought by this technological gap was crushing. You couldn't see the enemy, but the enemy was watching you. A Japanese officer lamented after the war, "We were dueling a blind swordsman, but he wasn't blind and he was wearing infrared goggles." The proliferation of radar technology marked the transition of war from an era of sensory confrontation to sensor confrontation.
Chapter 36. Hitler's Personal Enemy. Eisenhower once said, "Andrew Higgins won the war for us." Higgins wasn't a general, he was a boat builder in New Orleans. He invented the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, famously known as the Higgins boat. This flat-bottomed, wooden boat with a steel ramp solved a problem that had plagued military strategists for thousands of years: how to get an army onto a shore without a port. Higgins boats had an extremely shallow draft, could charge directly onto the beach, drop the ramp, let 36 soldiers or a jeep land in seconds, and then quickly reverse away. Hitler angrily called Higgins the Noah of New Orleans. Why? Because it meant the Atlantic Wall became meaningless. The US no longer needed to attack heavily fortified ports. They could choose to land on any beach in Normandy, Sicily, or Okinawa. At its peak, this factory had 30,000 workers and produced 20,000 landing craft. This small boat, cobbled together from plywood and steel, broke the boundary between ocean and land, turning the entire European coastline into America's backyard. Chapter 37. The Geometry of the Quonset hut. If the symbol of the Roman legion was the phalanx, the symbol of US logistics was the semicircle. This was the Quonset hut. The US military needed a barracks that was quick to build, durable, and easy to transport. The designer's answer was a semicircular corrugated steel structure. It required no foundation, no pillars, and had extremely high internal space utilization. More importantly, its components could be stacked like playing cards for transport. On desolate islands in the Pacific, on the frozen soil of Iceland, wherever American bulldozers passed, rows of silvery white semicircular roofs would grow a few days later. Inside could be dormitories, hospitals, bakeries, or even officers' clubs. For Japanese soldiers living in leaking tents or enduring rheumatism in damp caves, these metal houses were unbelievable mansions. They were windproof, rainproof, insect-proof, and could even be fitted with screens and fans. This standardized living unit allowed the US military to quickly replicate an American community wherever they fought. War is fluid, but the quality of life for the US military was fixed. Chapter 38. Sparks of Welding. Before 1940, shipbuilding was an art. Workers connected steel plates one by one with rivets. Building a freighter took months. But Henry Kaiser said, "No, shipbuilding should be like making sausages." He introduced assembly line welding technology. This was the birth of the Liberty ship. Riveting required 3 people. Welding required only 1. Prefabricated ship sections were built in factories and welded together in the dry dock like a puzzle. The craziest record occurred in 1942. A Liberty ship named the Robert E. Perry took only 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. This speed made German U-boat commanders despair. Donitz's Wolfpack tactic relied on sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. But in the face of American welding sparks, this formula failed. Germans sank 1, Americans built 2. It was a victory of arithmetic. When the light of welding torches illuminated the night sky of the US West, the coffin lid of Nazi Germany was already welded shut. Chapter 39. Unmelting Chocolate. Hershey's received a special order from the military: produce a chocolate that wouldn't melt in tropical heat. And the military had a strange requirement: it couldn't taste too good. Why? Because if it tasted too good, soldiers would eat it as a snack instead of saving it for emergencies. Thus, the D ration, Field Ration D, was born. Made of a mix of chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and vitamins, it was as hard as a brick with a melting point of 49 degrees Celsius, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It reportedly tasted a little better than a boiled potato. Although American soldiers hated it, calling it Hitler's secret weapon, in the eyes of starving enemy troops, it was food from the gods. This block of chocolate symbolized the technical content of the US food industry. They could not only make food delicious, but also precisely control the physical properties and taste of food to suit tactical needs. When Japanese soldiers watched candy turn into goo in their hands due to the heat, the D ration in American soldiers' pockets remained as hard as iron, ready to provide 600 calories of energy. Chapter 40. The 2.5-ton steel spine. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, affectionately called the Deuce and a Half by GIs. This was no ordinary truck. It was the spine of U.S. land logistics in WWII. The U.S. produced over 560,000 of these trucks. It had 6 wheels, all-wheel drive, and was as tough as a mule. It hauled soldiers, shells, flour, and even corpses. In the Soviet theater, when the Red Army received these trucks from U.S. aid, they were moved to tears. Before this, Soviet logistics relied on horse-drawn carts and 2 legs. With these hundreds of thousands of Deuce and a Halves, Zhukov's armored units gained the ability to conduct deep penetrations across the Great Plains. For the Germans, this was a humiliation of mobility. Although the Germans possessed advanced tanks, their logistics corps was still a mix of numerous horse-drawn wagons. When U.S. troops advanced at 40 miles per hour sitting in trucks, German supply lines were still struggling in the mud. The speed of this war was defined by this unassuming truck. Chapter 41. The industrial design of morphine. Being wounded is painful, but on the battlefield, more terrifying than pain is the inability to find painkillers. Before WWII, administering morphine required a doctor to handle glass bottles and syringes, drawing liquid in the chaos of a trench. It was slow, and glass broke easily. The U.S. introduced the morphine syringe. This was a toothpaste-like small metal tube with a needle attached at the front, sealed inside a sterile cover. To use it, a soldier simply broke the seal, inserted it into the thigh, squeezed the tube, and threw it away. This simple design saved countless lives. It gave every ordinary soldier emergency medical capability. More importantly, it was disposable. In the resource-scarce Axis armies, needles were precious assets that had to be re-sterilized and reused, often leading to infection. But for the US, even syringes were fast-moving consumer goods. This use and toss design philosophy demonstrated the extreme affluence of the American medical industry. To save those few seconds, we were willing to waste metal and medicine. Chapter 42. The Flying Jeep. The L-4 Grasshopper liaison plane was a tiny aircraft with only 65 horsepower, possessing neither armor nor weapons. Its structure was so simple, it was like a bicycle with wings. But it was the target German artillerymen hated most. Because it flew slow, flew low, and was everywhere. In its back seat sat an artillery observer holding a radio. As long as a grasshopper circled overhead, minutes later, U.S. heavy artillery would cover German concealed positions as if they had eyes. German ace pilots looked down on this sluggish little plane, but they found it hard to shoot down. It flew too slow and too low. The U.S. produced tens of thousands of these small planes. They turned the sky into American watchtowers. This proved a principle. In systemic warfare, an observer with a radio is more lethal than a heavy bomber. Chapter 43. The Alchemy of Rubber. In early 1942, Japan occupied Southeast Asia, cutting off 90% of the global supply of natural rubber. This should have been fatal for the U.S. Without rubber, there are no tires, planes cannot land, trucks cannot drive, and the war machine would be paralyzed. Japan thought this was the trump card to defeat America. But they underestimated the explosive power of the American chemical industry. President Roosevelt ordered synthetic rubber to be given a priority equal to the Manhattan Project. American petrochemical giants joined forces and within 18 months built a massive synthetic rubber industrial system from scratch. By 1944, U.S. synthetic rubber production exceeded the total global production of natural rubber before the war. Japan's blockade not only failed to strangle the U.S., but forced the creation of a new chemical giant. When U.S. Jeeps sped across Pacific Islands on new synthetic tires, it was a victory of alchemy. It told the world, resources can be created as long as your technology tree reaches high enough.
Chapter 44. The Unheard Storm. The Normandy landings were scheduled for June 5th, but the weather was terrible, with storms raging. The German meteorological department predicted this weather would last at least 2 weeks, so Rommel felt safe enough to go back to Germany for his wife's birthday, and German alertness relaxed. But Allied meteorologists, relying on a massive observation network deployed in Greenland, Iceland, and at sea, found a fleeting good weather window, a brief calm on the morning of June 6th. Eisenhower seized on this intelligence and issued the order to attack. The largest amphibious landing in human history was actually built on a weather forecast. The Germans lost because they didn't have enough weather stations. Their weather ships in the Atlantic had been sunk by the Allies. They could only guess by looking at the sky above them. The Allies, however, were making decisions by watching the atmospheric circulation of the entire Atlantic. This is the highest realm of information warfare, using the Earth's atmospheric currents to strike the enemy. When the Allied fleet rushed out of the mist, the Germans were surprised not just by the number of enemies, but by the fact that the enemy seemed to control the weather. Chapter 45: Firefighters versus Bushido. In the Battle of Midway, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, largely due to poor damage control. Japanese sailors were brave, but lacked professional training. Once a fire started, they were often at a loss, leading to magazine explosions. They believed in offense and considered defense and damage control secondary. In contrast, damage control teams on U.S. carriers were among the most respected men on the ship. They underwent rigorous firefighting training, equipped with advanced phone extinguishers, asbestos suits, and powerful pumps. The famous carrier USS Yorktown, after being heavily damaged by the Japanese, had its fires extinguished and deck repaired by damage control teams within hours, even restoring flight capability. When Japanese planes flew over a second time, they thought it was a brand new ship. The US treated unsinkability as a science. They studied the path of fire and the sealing of compartments. This was a victory of concept. Protecting one's assets is more important than destroying the enemies. Because a repaired carrier can fight again tomorrow, a sunken carrier remains only a legend of bravery. Chapter 46: The Inflatable Ghost. Before the Normandy landings, the U.S. formed a special unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, commonly known as the Ghost Army. Their weapons were not tanks, but inflatable rubber models, giant loudspeakers, and radio transmitters. This group of artists, designers, and sound engineers arranged hundreds of inflatable tanks and planes in the fields of England. They played recorded sounds of armored columns moving through massive speakers, loud enough to be heard 20 kilometers away. They also forged massive radio traffic, creating the illusion that General Patton's army was about to land at Calais. The Germans were thoroughly deceived. They moved their main armored divisions in the wrong direction to defend against an air army that didn't exist. This industrialized deception operation proved that the US was good at manufacturing not only real matter, but also virtual matter. When the Germans found those tanks blown sideways by the wind, the humiliation of being played was more intense than being defeated by real tanks. Chapter 47: Paperbacks in the Trenches. The U.S. military believed that a soldier's brain needed feeding just as much as his stomach. In 1943, the military partnered with publishers to launch Armed Services Editions, ASE. These books were specially designed, sized to fit perfectly into a cargo pant pocket, printed horizontally for one-handed reading, using thin paper. The content ranged from Shakespeare to contemporary novels, from history to comics. The U.S. printed 120 million of these books and distributed them free to frontline soldiers. In foxholes in Normandy, on decks in the Pacific, you would see GIs reading The Great Gatsby or A Tree Grows in Brooklyn during lulls in combat. The impact on morale was profound. It kept soldiers humane in an environment of slaughter. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany was burning books, and the Japanese army was reading dry tactical manuals. This library-in-a-pocket movement not only won the war, but fostered the reading habits of an entire generation of Americans post-war. It was an intellectual logistical victory. Chapter 48: The Hegemony of Frequency. Early in WWII, tank-to-tank communication relied mainly on semaphore flags or AM radios with terrible sound quality, full of static noise. The US was the first to implement FM radio technology on a large scale. Motorola's SCR-300 walkie-talkie and SCR-536 handy-talkie made communication as clear as a phone call. This meant a U.S. squad leader could call his platoon leader, the platoon leader could call a tank, and the tank could call an airplane. German tank commander Guderian once enviously said, "The Americans' coordination is so good because everyone has a telephone in their hand." While the Japanese were still using bugles and shouting to direct charges, the U.S. had built an invisible electromagnetic web. This network made U.S. reaction times incredibly fast. A soldier spots a target, 2 minutes later, shells land. This isn't a victory of soldiers, it's a victory of bandwidth. Chapter 49. Thermite and Napalm. If the B-29 was the delivery vehicle, then napalm was its scythe of death. American chemists discovered that mixing gasoline with naphthenic and palmitic acids created a sticky gel. This substance burned at extremely high temperatures and stuck to surfaces without being shaken off. Water couldn't extinguish it. Instead, it would spread the flow. Originally designed to attack fortified bunkers, in the late Pacific War, it was used to burn Japanese wooden cities. In the firebombing of Tokyo, the U.S. dropped thousands of tons of these incendiary bombs. This was industrialized slaughter. Chemical equations were converted into city-sized firestorms. For those on the ground, it was incomprehensible terror, raining fire from the sky, boiling rivers, melting steel. This demonstrated the cold side of the U.S. military. To end the war, they were willing to unleash chemical demons and physically erase the enemy's habitat from the map. Chapter 50. The Science of Socks. In the cold European winter, trench foot was a disease that could lead to amputation. Feet soaked in cold, muddy water for too long would become necrotic. In World War I, this caused hundreds of thousands of non-combat casualties. By WWII, Eisenhower listed dry socks as a strategic material. U.S. logistics designed a complex system, waterproof combat boots combined with wool blend socks. More importantly, specialized vehicles delivered clean, dry socks to the front lines every day, forcing soldiers to change them. It sounded like nagging, but the effect was amazing. The incidence of trench foot in the U.S. Army was far lower than in the German Army. German soldiers in the ice and snow of Stalingrad wrapped their feet in newspapers for warmth. American soldiers in the Ardennes, though cold, had dry feet. This reflected a core U.S. philosophy: soldiers are expensive assets. Maintaining soldiers is like maintaining tanks. It requires a scientific maintenance manual. A pair of dry socks is the smallest unit of this maintenance system.
Chapter 51. Bulldozers in the Jungle. In the battle for Pacific Islands, Japanese troops often hid in fortified underground bunkers, creating crossfire nets with machine guns. Charging them was suicide. Destroying them with explosives was difficult. The U.S. solution was simple and brutal: armored bulldozers. They mounted thick steel plates on the front of Caterpillar bulldozers, covering them as they drove up to Japanese bunkers. Then, the bulldozer scooped up tons of earth and directly buried the firing ports, or simply bulldozed the entire bunker flat, burying the Japanese inside alive. This was a highly insulting tactic. The Japanese believed in Bushido, longing to die gloriously in hand-to-hand combat. But the U.S. refused to cooperate. The U.S. used road-building tools to bury them like filling a landfill. It told the enemy, "In our eyes, you are not warriors. You are just roadblocks that need clearing." Chapter 52. Disney's War. How do you quickly teach millions of newly enlisted farmers and workers to operate complex radars, machine guns, and planes? Lectures by instructors were too slow. The U.S. military brought in Walt Disney. The Disney studio paused most entertainment production during the war and turned to making thousands of military training animations. Mickey Mouse demonstrated how to defend against gas. Donald Duck demonstrated how to pay taxes. Exquisite animated cross-sections explained engine principles. These films were easy to understand, humorous, and highly efficient. Soldiers learned killing skills amidst laughter. This was also industrial strength, the industrialization of education. While the Japanese were still relying on veterans beating recruits to pass on experience, the U.S. was already using Hollywood's audio-visual language to mass-produce qualified technical troops. Chapter 52. Searchlights and Artificial Daylight.
Night combat used to be an Allied weakness until the appearance of the Canal Defense Light, CDL, and high-power searchlights. These weren't ordinary lights, they were strobe-keepable arc lights mounted on tanks. They emitted intense light flashing dozens of times per second, temporarily blinding the enemy's readiness and causing dizziness and nausea. Additionally, the US used artificial moonlight tactics on the battlefield, shining giant searchlights at the clouds using diffuse reflection to illuminate the entire battlefield. This turned night into day. German soldiers discovered with fear that they had lost the cover of darkness. Under this ghostly pale light, the US launched attacks. This technology stripped the weak of their last protective color granted by nature. The US arrogantly declared, "We control not just the land and sea, we control the light." Chapter 54, Ocean of Surplus. In 1945, the war ended. The US faced a new problem: too much stuff. In Okinawa, in the Philippines, in Europe, mountains of tanks, planes, and jeeps became burdens. The US method of disposal shocked the world. What couldn't be sold was destroyed directly. Brand new fighters were crushed by bulldozers. Thousands of jeeps were dumped into the sea. Brand new aircraft engines were sold as scrap metal. This scene of waste was the final climax of this industrial epic. It sent a chilling message to the world. This war, which consumed the last drop of blood of the Axis powers, for the United States, merely used up a portion of its inventory. We even have enough surplus to throw away for fun. This is absolute, excessive, despair-inducing industrial strength. Chapter 55, Carpet of Steel. On the rainy islands of the Pacific, mud was a more stubborn enemy than the Japanese. Wheels sank, planes couldn't take off. The Japanese solution was to lay crushed stone, which took massive manpower and time. The US solution was Marston matting, pierced steel planking. These were prefabricated perforated steel plates, each weighing 60 pounds with hooks on the edges. The laying speed was incredibly fast. A team of engineers hooked these plates together like laying a carpet. In just a few hours, a mud pit could be turned into a steel runway capable of handling heavy bombers. This portable airport completely changed the rhythm of island-hopping tactics. After the US captured an island, the Japanese commander expected the Americans would need a week to build an airfield. The next day, he heard the roar of US fighters taking off from that very island. This perforated steel plate was the ultimate embodiment of the US military's ability to change geography. Since we can't make the dirt hard, we'll put armor on the earth. Chapter 56, Hydroponic Tomatoes on Rocks. In 1945, on newly captured desolate islands like Ascension or Iwo Jima, the US faced a lack of fresh vegetables. The usual solution was canned food, but the Quartermaster Corps believed soldiers going too long without fresh vegetables would affect morale. So they moved agriculture onto the rocks. The US established massive hydroponic farms on these barren volcanic islands. Using chemical nutrient solutions, gravel beds, and metal troughs, the US grew lettuce, cucumbers, radishes, and tomatoes out of thin air. Imagine the scene. A few hundred meters away, remnant Japanese troops hid in dark, damp tunnels, chewing on moldy rice grains and drinking dirty water from rock crevices. Meanwhile, in the US camp, GIs were lining up to receive freshly picked bright red tomatoes to make salad with mayonnaise. This was biological humiliation. It told the enemy, we bring not just guns and cannons, we bring an ecosystem. We don't even need soil to create life in this land of death. Chapter 57, The Expensive Taxi. In the Pacific Theater, if an American pilot was shot down into the sea, his mindset was usually not despair, but waiting, because he knew Dumbo was coming. The PBY Catalina seaplane was the US Army's air ambulance. They would brave enemy fire and land on rough seas just to fish out a downed pilot. Sometimes to save one man, the US was willing to dispatch a fighter squadron for cover, even risking the loss of the rescue plane. This cost-no-object rescue contrasted sharply with the Japanese Gyokusai, shattering like a jewel. Japanese pilots were told to die with their planes. Parachuting was shameful. But American pilots knew the nation spent far more on training them than on the plane. This security allowed American pilots to dare the boldest maneuvers and fly to the limit of their range, because they knew a massive search and rescue network was behind them. This was not just humanitarianism, this was calculated human resource management. Chapter 59. Not just body bags. Handling the fallen is the darkest logistics of war. On the Eastern Front, tens of thousands of corpses were often hastily buried in mass graves or left to be eaten by wild dogs. But the U.S. had the specialized Graves Registration Service. The mission of this unit? Give dignity to death. Give closure to families. They went to the battlefield with typewriters, fingerprint kits, and dental charts. They tried to identify every broken body. The U.S. established standardized temporary cemeteries. Every body was put into a dedicated body bag or coffin, if conditions permitted, marked with a standard cross or Star of David. This bureaucratic management of the dead was a huge comfort to the living. Soldiers knew that even if they died, they wouldn't become nameless ghosts. Their personal effects would be mailed home, and their names would be carved on headstones. This guarantee of after-death affairs was a crucial part of maintaining morale. It proved that in this giant industrial meat grinder, the individual was still seen as a person, not a consumable. Chapter 60. Aerial Mule C-47. If the Jeep ruled the ground, the C-47 Skytrain ruled the sky. It was not a fighter, it had no guns. It was responsible only for transport. It carried paratroopers to Normandy, gasoline to China, and wounded back to the rear. Production exceeded 10,000 aircraft. Eisenhower listed it as one of the 4 weapons that won the war. In the Burma theater, when the Japanese cut off the Burma Road, they thought the Chinese army would collapse from starvation, but they saw the sky filled with C-47s. This hump route was a miracle in aviation history. The U.S. used airplanes, the most premium form of transport, to carry rice, bullets, and even truck parts. It was an extremely uneconomical account. Transporting 1 ton of supplies over the Himalayas consumed tons of aviation fuel. But the U.S. didn't care about the cost. With an extravagance that ignored economic laws, they forcibly maintained an aerial lifeline. The Japanese tried to blockade the land. The U.S. simply skipped over the land.
Chapter 61. Ma Deuce that never jams. The M2 Browning heavy machine gun, affectionately known as Ma Deuce. This weapon, designed in 1921, is still in service with the U.S. military today. Why? Because it is perfect. In WWII, it was everywhere, on tanks, on planes, on jeeps, in infantry positions, and even on landing craft. The .5 caliber bullets it fired could punch through light armor, snap trees in half, and tear human bodies apart. For German infantry, the sound of the M2 was the knock of the Grim Reaper. Even more despairing was its reliability and quantity. German machine guns, like the MG-42, had an incredibly high rate of fire, but the barrels overheated easily, required frequent changing, and were sensitive to dust. The M2 was simple, rugged, and durable. The U.S. produced 2 million M2 machine guns. This meant that in any corner of the battlefield, the U.S. could suppress the enemy with a larger caliber and longer range. It was a simple, brutal overflow of firepower. Chapter 62. The Machine That Drinks Seawater. In the Pacific War, fresh water was a resource scarcer than bullets. When capturing Palaleo, temperatures reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 46 degrees Celsius. The Japanese defenders survived by drinking stagnant water or even urine. Although the U.S. had water tankers, they also faced supply difficulties. So, engineers brought out solar stills and seawater desalination tablets. More importantly, large vehicle-mounted distillation units. These machines drove to the seaside, stuck a pipe in, and drinkable fresh water flowed out the other end. While Japanese soldiers were delirious from dehydration, risking death at night to crawl out of tunnels to lick dew off plants, American soldiers were showering with fresh water. This technology freed the U.S. military from dependence on natural water sources. This war proved once again, science and technology are the primary combat forces, especially when they solve the problem of drinking water. Chapter 63. Technicolor Killing. Our impression of WWII is mostly black and white, but in reality, the U.S. military shot a vast amount of color film during the war. Hollywood directors, like John Ford and William Wyler, took professional cameras and Kodak color film to the front lines. Furthermore, U.S. fighters were equipped with gun cameras. As soon as the trigger was pulled, the camera automatically recorded. This was originally for evaluating battle results, but it became a form of psychological deterrence. After the war, when these clear, colored images were released, people were shocked. Blood was bright red, fire was orange-yellow, and the sky was azure blue. This recording capability itself was a luxury. The Germans and Japanese were filming too, but as the war progressed, their film quality deteriorated and developing chemicals became scarce. The US recorded every moment of destroying their opponents in the highest definition. This was a seizure of historical interpretation rights. We not only defeated you, we filmed the process of defeating you like a blockbuster movie. Chapter 64. The Sausage-like Victory Ship. The Liberty ship was fast enough, but the US military felt it wasn't good enough. Liberty ships had a speed of only 11 knots, easily caught by submarines. So, by 1944, the US began producing Victory ships. They were faster, 15 to 17 knots, larger, and equipped with more advanced steam turbines. While other countries were heartbroken over sunken ships, the US was already doing product iteration. It was like you just wrecked the enemy's old car, and the next day, the enemy drove up in a brand new sports car. The speed of this industrial upgrade gave the Axis powers a deep sense of powerlessness. We can't even maintain the status quo, and they are still evolving. Chapter 66. The Lights of Oak Ridge. In 1944, a city appeared out of nowhere in a remote valley in Tennessee, Oak Ridge. It had a population of 75,000 and the largest factory building in the world, but it couldn't be found on a map. It was the core uranium enrichment facility of the Manhattan Project. The most terrifying statistic here was electricity consumption. To run those massive electromagnetic separators, Oak Ridge consumed electricity equivalent to the entire city of New York. Or rather, it consumed 1/7 of the total power generation of the US at that time. What does this mean? To make a gadget, the atomic bomb, the US was willing to invest electricity resources equivalent to that of a medium-sized country. Meanwhile, in Japan, due to fuel shortages, many factories had stopped work and cities were under blackouts. The brightly lit nights of Oak Ridge, though secret, were the most dazzling symbol of US industrial might. It was a weapon of destruction piled up with pure energy. Chapter 66. Floating Power Plants. In the European theater, every time the Allies captured a city, retreating Germans would usually blow up the power plants, trying to leave darkness for the Allies. But the US brought Jacona-class floating power plants. This wasn't an ordinary ship. It was a floating 30-megawatt thermal power plant. It sailed into the harbor, hooked up cables, and drinkable fresh water flowed out the other end. The psychological impact on local residents was immense. It proved the Allies were bringers of light, literally. This was also the ultimate in logistics. We don't lack electricity, we can even package electricity and ship it to you. Chapter 67. Reading the Enemy's Brain. Cryptography, SIGINT, was the quietest but deadliest battlefield in WWII. Japan had the Purple Code, and Germany had Enigma. They both thought their codes were unbreakable. But the US Magic Project and the British Ultra Project were actually reading the enemy's top secrets, like reading a newspaper. The US built massive Bombay electromechanical computers to brute force crack codes. At the Battle of Midway, the US knew every move of the Japanese. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku was shot down because the US knew his schedule precisely, calculating even when he would go to the bathroom. This was a dimensional strike in the information dimension. When German generals held meetings, the US was like an invisible stenographer sitting next to them. This omniscient perspective allowed the US to achieve maximum results with minimum cost. They weren't guessing riddles. They were taking the exam with the answer key.
Chapter 68. The Choke of Ball Bearings. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Force, 8th Air Force, had a famous target list. Top of the list wasn't tank factories, but ball-bearing factories, like Schweinfurt. Why? Because modern war is built on rotation. Plane engines, tank wheels, radar antennas, submarine propellers, all mechanical movement requires bearings. The U.S. calculated precisely. As long as German bearing capacity was destroyed, the entire German war machine would stop due to friction. Meanwhile, U.S. domestic bearing production was astronomical. This demonstrated the systemic warfare thinking of the U.S. military. Like surgeons, they tried to sever a specific vessel of the enemy's industrial body. Although Germany later survived by dispersing production, this industrial node-targeting approach left Germany running ragged, with production efficiency dropping drastically. Chapter 69. Ocean in a Bottle. The Lister bag and halazone tablets. These two inconspicuous items hung from every tree in WWII U.S. camps. That canvas water bag, with its own tap, was filled with chlorinated drinking water. No matter how dirty the local water source, American soldiers could always drink cold water that tasted of bleach but was absolutely safe. For Japanese troops tormented by dysentery and cholera, this was an unattainable hygiene standard. The U.S. even brought ice machines to the front lines. In the stifling jungle, a cup of powdered lemon drink with ice cubes was a reward more practical than any medal. Chapter 70. Standardized feet. Before 1941, U.S. military boots came in left and right, but the fit was average. After the war began, footwear experts in Boston scanned the feet of 100,000 soldiers and established big data. The U.S. introduced multiple widths, narrow, medium, wide, for combat boots. This meant whether you had big farmer feet from Kentucky or small lawyer feet from New York, you could get a pair of boots that fit. This was a miracle of the garment industry. The standardization of ready-to-wear reached the level of custom-made. Comfortable boots meant faster marching speeds and fewer blisters. This was a war won by size charts and shoe lasts. Chapter 71. Aerial Nurses. In 1944, if an American soldier was wounded in France, his chance of survival was 96%. Why? Because of air evac. After unloading cargo, C-47 transport planes installed stretcher racks, turning into ambulances. Even more, flight nurses attended to them. A soldier shot in the Ardennes forest in the morning might be lying in a clean hospital bed in England drinking hot milk by evening. This compression of time greatly alleviated the fear of the wounded. They knew injury wasn't the end, just a fast ticket home. Chapter 70. A Torrent of Aluminum. Late in the war, Japan began making wooden planes because aluminum supplies were exhausted. Germany began recycling wreckage of crashed planes to smelt aluminum. And America? American aluminum production was so vast it could be used to make mess kits, chair frames, anything. U.S. planes didn't even need recycling. Heavily damaged planes were pushed into the sea or left to rot because the cost of shipping them back for repair was higher than building new ones. This squandering of strategic metals made the Axis powers feel despair. Aluminum is the metal of flight. Whoever owns aluminum owns the sky. The capacity of Alcoa actually determined the ownership of air superiority in this war. Chapter 70. Pilot Rotation. In the Japanese military, ace pilots flew until they died. Veterans like Saburo Sakai flew with one eye blinded because there were no new recruits to take over. In the U.S. military, once you completed a certain number of missions, say 25 or 50, you were forced to rotate back home. To do what? To be an instructor, to sell war bonds, to vacation on the beach. This seemed to reduce frontline combat power, but in reality, it protected precious human capital. These veterans passed their experience to recruits, giving rookies a higher starting point. The result? Japanese pilots became fewer and worse as they fought. American pilots became more numerous and better. This was a sustainable war model. It relied not on the outburst of individual heroes, but on the average level of the entire system. Chapter 74. Chocolate Redemption. In 1945, when Allied tanks rolled into German towns or jeeps drove into Japanese villages, the first battle wasn't a gunfight but a candy war. GIs pulled chocolate and gum from their pockets and handed them to starving children by the roadside. This wasn't an official order, it was spontaneous soldier behavior. But it was the most powerful conquest. For these children, the men in khaki uniforms were not demons, but bringers of sweetness. This calorie diplomacy rapidly melted hatred. In Berlin and Tokyo, former mortal enemies began lining up for U.S. relief food. This echoes our theme again. Industrial power can not only destroy the enemy, but can instantly switch roles to become the enemy's feeder. When you eat food given by the conqueror, it is hard to maintain hatred. This is the ultimate form of absolute zero humiliation.
I defeated you, and now I feed you. Chapter 75. Swarm Tactics of Cheap Carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy worshipped big ships and big guns, building the largest battleship in human history, the Yamato. The U.S. Navy went to the other extreme, building escort carriers, CVE, nicknamed Jeep carriers. These were small carriers converted from merchant ship hulls, with armor as thin as paper and slow speeds, jokingly called combustible, vulnerable, expendable by sailors. But their numbers were terrifying. Kaiser shipyards promised launch one carrier every week. Ultimately, the U.S. produced 122 escort carriers of various types. When the main Japanese fleet looked for a decisive battle with the main U.S. fleet, they found themselves surrounded by these cheap swarms. Although these small carriers were weak individually, they blanketed the sea. They were responsible for anti-submarine warfare, ground support, and transporting aircraft. This proved the logic of U.S. industry. One perfect warship cannot win a war, but 100 mediocre warships can drown you.
Chapter 76. The Swimming Truck. In amphibious landings, the biggest bottleneck was the last mile. Cargo ships stopped in deep water. Cargo had to be unloaded onto small boats, transported to the beach, unloaded again, and loaded onto trucks. These two loading/unloading processes were time-consuming and dangerous. The U.S. introduced the WWII, which soldiers called the Duck. This was a boat with wheels, or a swimming truck. It drove directly to the side of the freighter to take cargo, swam to the beach, and, without stopping, drove onto the road to deliver supplies to frontline warehouses. In the invasion of Sicily, British commanders originally looked down on this comical vehicle. But when storms destroyed port facilities, only these ducks continued shuttling through the wind and waves, maintaining the supply of the entire Army Corps. It broke the boundary between water and land. For German defenders, this meant the U.S. supply line was a continuous fluid with no breakpoints to strike. Chapter 77. The Math of Survivorship Bias. The U.S. military had not only engineers but also statisticians. This is operations research. A famous example concerns aircraft armor. The military found that returning bombers had the most bullet holes in the wings, so they suggested reinforcing wing armor. But statistician Abraham Wald said, no, you should reinforce the places with no holes, like engines and cockpits. Because planes hit in the wings came back, while planes hit in the engines fell into the sea, and you never saw them. This was an intellectual dimensional strike. While Germans and Japanese were still making decisions based on generals' intuition and Bushido spirit, the Americans were already optimizing war with probability theory and data analysis. They calculated the optimal convoy size and the best depth charge settings. This war was won on a blackboard first, then on the battlefield. Chapter 78. Disposable Wooden Wings. Gliders, like the Waco CG-4, were key to the Normandy airborne operations. Made of plywood and canvas, without engines, they were towed into the air by transport planes, then released to glide to a landing. These were essentially disposable aircraft. Landings often smashed them to pieces, and soldiers called them flying coffins. But the U.S. produced 14,000 of these wooden planes. Why? Because they were cheap, didn't require precious aluminum, and didn't require pilots with high skills. They just needed to crash land. This demonstrated the U.S. definition of assets. As long as it can deliver a platoon of soldiers and a jeep behind enemy lines, this plane is worth it even if it's destroyed. To the resource-starved Axis powers, building a plane only to intentionally crash it was incomprehensible luxury. Chapter 79. Psychological Warfare of a Clean Chin. In muddy trenches, beards are the enemy of hygiene and the killer of gas masks. The U.S. military signed contracts with Gillette to produce hundreds of millions of blades and simple razors. U.S. regulations required soldiers to shave every day. This seemed like formalism, but it was powerful psychological warfare. When German prisoners saw U.S. soldiers just coming off combat, with clean faces, smooth chins, and smelling of aftershave, they felt a huge sense of defeat. Stubble represented exhaustion, chaos, and barbarism. A clean face represented order, discipline, and material abundance. It told the enemy,
Even when killing, we maintain the decency of civilized people. Chapter 80. The Escape Map in the Deck. The United States playing card company, Bicycle, received a secret mission from military intelligence. They produced a special deck of cards. If you soaked the cards in water and peeled apart the paper layers, a waterproof silk map was hidden inside. Putting the whole deck together formed a complete escape map of Europe, marking German POW camps and escape routes. These cards were issued to pilots or mailed to POWs via Red Cross packages. This was an industrial creativity that hit intelligence within entertainment. German guards watched POWs play cards to pass the time, unaware that they were holding the keys home in their hands. This demonstrated the precision of U.S. industry. We can build not only big bombs, but also the tiniest spy tools. Chapter 81. The Underground Oil River. In 1942, German U-boats were furiously hunting tankers off the U.S. East Coast. Transporting Texas oil to New York became extremely dangerous. The American response was not to add more escort warships, but to dig. This was the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipeline project. It was the largest pipeline project in the world at the time, stretching 1,200 miles from Texas directly to New Jersey. Thousands of workers and bulldozers completed the construction in just 1 year. From then on, the submarines became ineffective. Oil no longer traveled by sea, it flowed underground. German Admiral Donitz looked at the map, confused by the sharp drop in tanker targets. He didn't know that the Americans had buried this artery several feet underground. This is a classic case of engineering defeating tactics. If you can blockade the ocean, I will go by land. If you blockade the land, I will go underground. Chapter 82. The Obedient Torpedo. Anti-submarine warfare had always been like looking for a needle in a haystack, until the U.S. invented the Mark 24 Fido. This was not an ordinary torpedo, it was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. It didn't need to be aimed. Just drop it near a submarine and it would automatically track the sound of the propeller. U.S. pilots were told, if you see a sub dive, don't bomb it, let the dog, Fido, loose. For German submarine crews, this was a horror story. They dove deep, cut their engines, and thought they were safe. But then they would hear a buzzing sound getting closer, like a hound they couldn't shake off. Behind this lay the black technology of the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory. It marked the transition of weaponry from the ballistic era to the smart era. Chapter 83. The White Hope Ship. In the battle for Pacific Islands, after American soldiers were wounded, they were sent to giant white ships anchored offshore, hospital ships, like the USS Comfort. These ships had operating rooms, X-ray machines, and even air-conditioned wards. Japanese soldiers, when wounded, often had to wait for death in stinking tunnels, or be shot by their superiors. American wounded could be lying on clean sheets eating ice cream within hours. These white giants were brightly lit at night, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and because the US had air superiority. For the Japanese peering out from the darkness, these bright ships were both a temptation and an irony. They represented the US attitude toward life. We have enough steel to build killing machines, and we have enough steel to build saving machines. Chapter 84. The Transparent Nose. The nose of the B-17 and B-29 bombers was a transparent hemisphere. This wasn't glass. Glass was too heavy and fragile. This was plexiglass, a company called Roman Haas. The Roman Haas company expanded production of this new plastic dozens of times over. It was lightweight, tough, and optically superior. This gave bombardiers and gunners a godlike field of view. On an industrial level, this meant a victory for the chemical industry. While Japanese planes were still using celluloid that yellowed easily or heavy bulletproof glass, US planes were already equipped with this light, invisible armor. Through these transparent bubbles, US crews looked down on burning Tokyo, as if observing the Earth from a space capsule.
Chapter 85. The Rubber Shield. Venereal disease, VD, was a killer that caused massive non-combat casualties in WWI. In WWII, the US military launched a massive prevention campaign. The slogan was simple and brutal: put it on before you put it in. The US distributed hundreds of millions of condoms free of charge in ration packs, latrines, and PXs. This was not just a hygiene issue, it was a logistics issue. This required immense rubber capacity and latex technology. The result was that the U.S. infection rate was kept within an acceptable range, maintaining combat effectiveness. In the Japanese Army, however, syphilis and gonorrhea spread unchecked, severely weakening their constitution. The U.S. won this lower body war with industrial rubber. Chapter 86. Bathwater in the Helmet. The M1 helmet, that iconic green pot. It wasn't just designed to stop bullets. It was designed with a dual-layer structure. The inner layer was a lightweight fiber liner, and the outer layer was a steel shell. When resting, soldiers could detach the steel shell, turning it into a wash basin, a soup pot, or a digging tool. This versatility was the wisdom of industrial design. German helmets offered good protection but couldn't be used to cook rice. Japanese helmet liners molded easily. The U.S. produced 22 million M1 helmets. Decades after the war, you could still see them in Vietnam, Korea, and even on construction sites. It is a case of pragmatism stamped in steel. Chapter 87. The Mobile Church. The U.S. military cared not only for the body, but also for the soul. Chaplains were standard issue in units. The military issued standardized chaplain kits, inside or a portable altar, a cross, communion cups, and even a field organ. Whether in the ruins of Normandy or on the sands of the Pacific, open the box and it was a church. The U.S. printed millions of waterproof pocket Bibles. For soldiers struggling on the edge of life and death, this was immense spiritual comfort. German belt buckles read, Gott mit uns, God with us, but the Americans actually moved the church to the front lines. This spiritual logistics ensured that soldiers on the verge of mental collapse could be pulled back. Chapter 88. Drowning Fascism with Money. War requires money, massive amounts of money. The U.S. Treasury launched the largest marketing campaign in human history, war bonds. Hollywood stars, poster artists, and Boy Scouts were all mobilized. This wasn't forced taxation. This was using patriotism and commercial marketing to get ordinary citizens to willingly lend money to the government. As a result, the U.S. raised $185 billion. This meant that every worker turning a screw in a factory, every housewife, was a shareholder in this war. Germany relied on plundering occupied territories to maintain finances, while America relied on the wallets of its own citizens. This powerful financial mobilization capability transformed private wealth into a steel torrent on the front lines without triggering hyperinflation. Chapter 90. Spam for Stalin. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army fought the Germans with blood. But their trucks were American, their telephone wires were American, their boots were American, and most importantly, the meat in their stomachs was American. Lend-Lease provided the Soviet Union with 4.5 million tons of food. The most famous item was Spam. Khrushchev admitted in his memoirs, "Without American Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army." While Germans froze and starved to death in Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers in the trenches sliced open cans from Minnesota and used American trucks to tow artillery to the front. This was the spillover effect of U.S. industrial power. We can not only arm ourselves, we can incidentally arm our allies and feed half the planet's armies. Chapter 90. Rivet Gun and Lipstick. When the men went to the front, who built the planes? Women. Rosie the Riveter became the totem of the era. American women entered heavy industry on an unprecedented scale. They welded steel plates in shipyards and drove rivets in aircraft factories. This wasn't simple labor substitution, it was a revolution in social structure. The U.S. even improved factory equipment, introducing hydraulic assist tools so that physically weaker women could operate heavy machinery. In contrast, Nazi Germany adhered to the creed that women belong in the home, and only reluctantly mobilized women late in the war. Japan was even more conservative, preferring to send students to dig trenches. America's double labor force strategy kept its production lines running at full speed while men fought. Many of those exquisite rivets on bombers were driven by women wearing lipstick. Chapter 91. The Floating Printing Press. On a U.S. aircraft carrier, a newspaper was published every morning. This was no joke. The ship had full typesetting and mimeograph equipment.
Radio operators received news from the AP and UP wire services. Editors compiled it, printed it, and distributed it to thousands of sailors. Soldiers in the middle of the Pacific still knew the score of the New York Yankees game and the stock market. The right to this flow of information was seen by the U.S. military as part of life. It prevented soldiers from being disconnected from society and stopped the spread of rumors. On Japanese ships, information was strictly blockaded. Soldiers only heard what their superiors wanted them to hear. A newspaper with wet ink proved that this was an army composed of citizens, not a group of isolated death seekers. Chapter 92. Mobile Cinema. On newly captured islands, before the smoke had even cleared, U.S. engineers would bulldoze a clearing and hang up a giant white sheet. At night, the projector lit up. Thousands of soldiers sat on their helmets watching the latest Hollywood movies. Sometimes a movie was shown on the Pacific Front just 2 weeks after its U.S. release. Japanese troops in the jungle heard laughter and movie soundtracks coming from the distance and felt it was unbelievable. They were fighting a war. The Americans were throwing a party. This seamless integration of cultural life was the highest form of morale maintenance. It made war look less like hell and more like a dangerous job. After work, you could still watch a movie.
Chapter 93. Graphite in the reactor. To make an atomic bomb, you need plutonium. To make plutonium, you need a nuclear reactor. To control a reactor, you need ultra-pure graphite as a moderator. This wasn't just a mining issue, it was the ultimate in chemical purification. U.S. companies produced thousands of tons of graphite bricks with 99.99% purity. If there were even a trace of boron impurity, the reactor would stop working. At the Hanford site, these black bricks were stacked into giant pyramids, incubating the power to destroy the world inside. This was an industrial miracle invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't about size, it was about purity. This ability to control material purity was the mark of the American tech tree climbing to its apex. Chapter 94. Pen and Battleship. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay, USS Missouri. This massive battleship was itself the pinnacle of industry, its 16-inch guns pointing at the sky. But at this moment, the protagonists were not the cannons, but a table and a few fountain pens. General MacArthur used these pens to sign the Japanese instrument of surrender. It was a moment full of symbolism. Surrounded by thousands of Allied warships anchored nearby, thousands of U.S. planes flew overhead, blotting out the sun. This display wasn't for combat. It was to show inventory. Look, we have this much left. We have endless carriers, endless planes, endless pens. If you don't sign, this steel will fall on you. This was absolute zero humiliation, ending a bloody war with a silent, overwhelming industrial parade. When Japanese Representative Shigemitsu Mamoru dragged his crippled leg up the gangway, he saw not a group of conquerors, but an industrial monster he couldn't comprehend. The war was over. Industry won. Volume 5. The Legacy of Giants. Chapter 95. Silver Plates Subtraction. The B-29 bombers that dropped the atomic bombs were not ordinary B-29s. They belonged to a special project codenamed Silver Plate. To carry the 4.5-ton Little Boy or Fat Man, engineers made a startling decision: remove all defensive weapons. Except for the tailgun, all machine gun turrets, armor plates, and even observation windows were removed. Why? To save weight, to fly higher and faster. This was extreme confidence. The U.S. bet that the Japanese Air Force was paralyzed and couldn't intercept bombers flying at 30,000 feet. For Japanese air defenses, this was a humiliation. Enemy bombers strolled through their backyard, not even bothering to carry self-defense weapons. This stripped-down Enola Gay was a combination of industrial and tactical confidence. It was a supercar modified to deliver doomsday. Chapter 96. Operation Magic Carpet. Summer 1945, the war ended. Now the U.S. faced a math problem scarier than the Normandy landings: how to bring 8 million soldiers home from Europe, the Pacific, and Asia. This was Operation Magic Carpet.
The Navy converted over 300 Liberty and Victory ships into troop transports. Even aircraft carriers were requisitioned. Massive carrier hangars no longer held planes, but were packed with 5-tiered canvas bunks. A single ship, the USS Saratoga, could carry 29,000 men at once. This largest mass migration in human history demonstrated U.S. SEAL lift capability. We can take you to hell, the battlefield, and we can bring you back to heaven, home. When ships packed with soldiers sailed into New York or San Francisco harbors, greeted by fireboats spraying water, it was the industrial age's most spectacular curtain call. Chapter 98. Aluminum Housing Crisis. Millions of GIs came home. They needed to marry, have kids, and buy houses. America faced a severe housing shortage. Meanwhile, aircraft factories faced shutdowns, with mountains of aluminum having no use. Designers like Buckminster Fuller proposed bold ideas. Build houses with aircraft technology. Although all aluminum homes, like the Dymaxion house, didn't become widespread, aluminum window frames and siding became popular. More directly, thousands of military Quonset huts, semicircular tin sheds, were sold cheaply to universities as temporary classrooms and dorms. The first generation of post-war American college students completed their degrees in tin sheds originally designed to store bombs. This was an experiment in civilianizing industrial capacity. Chapter 99. Nylon Riots. During the war, all DuPont nylon went to making parachutes. American women, out of patriotism, had to draw lines on their legs to pretend they were wearing stockings. In 1945, nylon stockings returned to the market. The result was the Nylon Riots. In Pittsburgh, 40,000 women lined up to fight for 13,000 pairs of stockings, creating chaos that required police intervention. This wasn't a riot caused by hunger. It was a riot caused by consumer desire. It marked America's rapid switch from a war economy back to a consumer economy. While Europeans were still lining up for bread, Americans were lining up for fashion. This contrast showed who the winner was more intuitively than GDP data.
Chapter 100. T-shirts counterattack. Before World War II, the t-shirt was just naval underwear. Wearing it outside was considered indecent. But in the Pacific Theater, the heat was unbearable. GIs stripped off their uniforms and worked in just their white cotton undershirts. These photos were sent back home via Life magazine. Young people thought, "This is cool, this is tough." After the war, the t-shirt transformed from underwear to a fashion staple worn as outerwear. This was a cultural victory. The US exported not just democracy, but defined the global standard for men's dress. A simple, durable, industrially produced cotton shirt became the symbol of American freedom. Chapter 101. The Boneyard in the Desert. Tucson, Arizona. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Here, the climate is dry and the soil is hard as concrete. After the war ended, the U.S. military flew thousands of B-29s, B-17s, and P-51s here. They were lined up neatly in the desert, stretching as far as the eye could see. This is the famous Boneyard. Some of these planes had only flown a few dozen hours. They were brand new. Workers sealed their engines and coated them with protective layers. It was a shocking visual spectacle. A superpower parking billions of dollars of assets that had just won a war, in the desert like cars in a parking lot. It was a silent deterrent. We don't need them anymore, but if you dare to start trouble again, we can start them up at any time. Chapter 102. The High-Altitude Revolution of the Ballpoint Pen. Fountain pens leaked ink at high altitudes due to pressure changes. This was a major hassle for pilots. In 1945, Reynolds introduced the invention of the Biro brothers, the ballpoint pen. It used oil-based ink and a rolling ball, unaffected by air pressure. The U.S. military ordered massive quantities for pilots. After the war, this pen debuted at Gimbel's department store in New York for the astronomical price of $12.50, equivalent to about $180 today. 10,000 were sold on the first day. This little gadget, originally designed to solve a recording problem for bomber navigators, eventually eliminated the inkwell and became a standard tool of modern civilization. Chapter 104, The Aerosol War. In the Pacific, malaria carried by mosquitoes was lethal. To make insecticide spraying more effective, USDA researchers Goodhue and Sullivan invented the bug bomb. This was a small steel canister containing liquefied gas and insecticide. Press the nozzle and a killing mist sprayed out. Soldiers threw one in a tent and every mosquito died. After the war, this technology was rapidly civilianized. Hairspray, air fresheners, spray paint, all these cans and bottles of modern life originated from the US military's need to kill mosquitoes in the jungle. Chapter 105, Slinky and Silly Putty. Engineer Richard James originally intended to design a spring that could stabilize instruments on naval ships. One spring fell to the floor and walked. Thus, the Slinky was born. Engineer James Wright at General Electric's lab tried to find a substitute for rubber and invented a silicone substance with strange elastic properties. But the military found it useless. It became Silly Putty. These toys that swept the globe were scraps falling off America's massive military research machine. This proved that when you invest astronomical sums in materials research, even failed experiments can become profitable products. Chapter 106, Industrialized Charity. In 1947, the Marshall Plan was launched. The U.S. provided $13 billion in aid to war-torn Europe, including Germany. This wasn't cash, it was mostly supplies. American machines, American grain, American trucks. This wasn't just charity, it was finding a market for America's surplus industrial capacity while preventing Europe from turning red. When flour sacks stamped with USA were distributed to starving people in Berlin, the war truly ended. The US military destroyed German factories with bombs, then rebuilt them with Marshall Plan money. This is the logic of a god. Destruction and reconstruction are both within my whim. Chapter 108, Tupperware's Sealing Revolution. Earl Tupper worked at a DuPont factory where he obtained black polyethylene slag, a byproduct of oil refining. He refined this plastic during the war. After the war, he invented the Tupperware sealable bowl. That famous burp sound, the sound of sealing air out, was derived from the sealing principle of gas masks. This cheap, durable, lightweight plastic container revolutionized the way humans stored food. It was originally intended to save wartime materials, but it turned into a social tool for suburban housewives, the Tupperware party. Chapter 109, The Seed of the Transistor. The development of radar technology led to deep U.S. military research into semiconductor materials like germanium and silicon. Bell Labs was the core institution for radar R&D during World War II. In 1947, 3 scientists at Bell Labs invented the transistor. This is considered the most important invention of the 20th century. It replaced bulky vacuum tubes. Although born after the war, its gestation was entirely completed within the military research system of World War II. The phone and computer in your hand right now, if traced back to their roots, owe their existence to the U.S. military's frantic investment in radio technology during World War II.
Chapter 110, Jeep's Civilian Life. Willis Overland immediately launched a civilian version of the Jeep, the CJ series, after the war. It became the farmer's tractor, the construction worker's utility vehicle, the explorer's ride. It even spawned the Land Rover, a product imitated by the British after seeing the Jeep. The Jeep defined the concept of the SUV. It proved that a good military design is the ultimate in functionalism, and functionalism has a market in peacetime as well. Chapter 111, Memory of the Black Box. During the war, plane crashes were frequent. To figure out why planes fell out of the sky, laboratories began developing flight recorders. Although the initial forms were primitive, this engineering mindset of recording data to analyze failure was a legacy of the WWII aviation industry. The US military could not tolerate unexplained losses. This obsession with data later evolved into the standard of the modern aviation industry, the orange black box. Chapter 113, Inspiration from the Autobahn. As Eisenhower advanced into Germany, he was stunned by the German Autobahn. Even though Germany had been bombed into ruins, this wide, flat, grade-separated highway still allowed troops to maneuver rapidly. In contrast, the U.S. road system at the time was backward, with truck convoys often stuck on muddy state roads.
This seed sprouted in 1956, turning into the interstate highway system. The initial justification for this artery connecting America was national defense needs to rapidly evacuate cities and move troops in the event of nuclear war. Chapter 113, The Industrialization of Academia. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, sent millions of veterans to college. This was the largest mass higher education movement in human history. Harvard, Yale, and Stanford were no longer just clubs for aristocrats. They were packed with veterans in flight jackets. This stockpiled an astronomical number of engineers, doctors, and scientists for America's post-war economic boom. This too was an industrial logic, mass-producing intellectuals just like tanks. Chapter 114, Birth of the New Rome. The world of 1945 was a ruin. Britain was bankrupt, France was broken, Germany and Japan were flattened, and the Soviet Union was crippled, having lost 27 million people. Only the United States remained. Its mainland was unscathed, its industrial capacity had multiplied, it held 70% of the world's gold reserves, and it possessed the atomic bomb. This was not just winning a war, this was a coronation. America became the new Rome. Its armies were stationed in Berlin and Tokyo. Its dollar became the world currency, and its factories produced goods for the whole world. This story, which began with an industrial dimensional strike, ultimately ended with the establishment of a global empire of Pax Americana. The shock in the diaries of prisoners of war eventually turned into the world's awe and reliance on this power. Volume 6, The Silence of the Gears. Chapter 115, Twilight of Heroes. When the last gunshot faded over the Pacific, we buried not only tens of millions of bodies, but also an era. That was the Age of Heroes. For thousands of years, the protagonists of human warfare were Achilles, Xiang Yu, Napoleon, individuals who turned the tide with personal courage, tactical genius, and spiritual strength. Japanese militarism and Nazi Germany were the final gravediggers of this old era. They worshipped will, worshipped ace pilots, worshipped the Bushido of fighting 1 against 100. But this war ruthlessly declared, the individual is meaningless in the face of the industrial system. Your courage cannot stop my saturation bombing. Your exquisite swordsmanship cannot beat my napalm. Your genius intuition cannot outcalculate my operations research big data. The US military used mass-produced mediocrity to drown the finely crafted masterpieces of the Axis powers. This is a cruel truth. Modern war is no longer a duel of warriors, but a collision of factories. Whoever has more smokestacks, whoever's lathes turn faster, is the truth. Chapter 116, The Formatted World. Look at the world today. We live in standardized apartments derived from wartime barracks, eat Spam and energy bars derived from K-rations, wear t-shirts and nylon socks derived from military supplies, heat meals in microwaves derived from radar, and travel in jet airliners derived from military transports. Our container shipping, our global supply chains, our internet, preceded by military networks, all are built on the legacy of the WWII US logistics system. America didn't just win the war, it formatted the world. It turned the American standard, that pursuit of efficiency, standardization, mass production, and Coca-Cola-style happiness, into the global operating system. Whether in Ginza, Tokyo, or on the streets of Berlin, the prosperity you see is essentially the continuation of this industrial logic. Chapter 117, Logistics is Destiny. Nazi Germany's tanks were beautiful. Japan's Zero fighters were agile. They represented the ultimate in craftsmanship. But America's Liberty ships were ugly, Sherman tanks were mediocre, and Spam tasted bad. They represented the ultimate in industrial spirit. History ultimately chose ugly efficiency over exquisite scarcity. This leaves an eternal warning for all humanity. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. When the hot blood cools and the slogans fade, what truly determines the fate of a nation are those boring spreadsheets, dull assembly lines, and the roar of cranes in the harbor. Justice may be late, but logistics is never absent. Because only with sufficient logistics do you have the qualification to define what justice is. Final chapter, The Silence of the Gears. Now let us pull the lens back. Leave the smoke-filled Iwo Jima, leave the cold Ardennes forest, leave the busy New York harbor. Return to the silent desert after 1945, that airplane graveyard. Thousands of B-29 bombers sit quietly there, their silver fuselages gleaming in the sunset. They are not rusting, they are just sleeping. These mechanical beasts that once dropped fire and thunder are now silent. This silence is more deafening than the noise of war. It is a display of absolute power. It tells all who come after, we built them, we used them, we won, and then we threw them here. We don't care about the waste because we can build another 10,000 at any time. This is the ultimate deterrence of industrial civilization. Not slaughter, but production. Not anger, but inventory. On this planet ruled by steel, oil, and chips, the greatest fear is not the enemy's scream, but the low hum of that massive, precisely operating, emotional industrial gear.